And the word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except they're Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
We understand it's not just the South African model, and no less an authority than the United Nations and the International Court of Justice have their definition, which is the UN definition of 1972, which defines an apartheid system as a institutionalized, legalized system of domination and oppression of one group, racial group, over another or other racial groups in order to perpetuate their system of control, of oppression, of privilege over the other. And this is how they viewed the segregated system of apartheid with all its measures and laws, practices and violence, and applies anywhere in the world, which is why more and more people, including peace groups within Israel, like B'Tselem, have come to the view that apartheid doesn't only obtain in the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza besieged, as Jimmy Carter had referred to apartheid in the occupied territories, but throughout what is Israel, including those occupied territories, because of the discrimination over the Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, Bedouin, living within Israel itself. So it's important to have that in mind, and then to come to the crux so that we can then understand why, in fact, the United Nations, why the world, why the Palestinian solidarity movement, why the Palestinians themselves refer to Israel as an apartheid state. And of course, we understand why Israel tries to cover that up, because apartheid has got such a stigma. They have attempted from the time of Israel's inception to cover up, first of all, the ethnic cleansing, the dispossession of Palestinian land and rights, and the forcing by the gun and terror of Palestinians into neighboring states, into the then Gaza, the West Bank, these refugee areas. More and more the mask is falling as Israel lurches more and more to direct right-wing Trumpism, if we like, you know, the full-on acceptance like apartheid was, compared pre-1948, when there was racial discrimination, legislation and cruelty in South Africa. But pre the apartheid regime, they also attempted to cover it up somewhat.
Like the United States?
And then, for your listeners, I can tell you, Paul, that the more one understands and looks at American, United States, North American history, the history of dispossession of the Native American peoples of North and South America, the genocide and so on, and the status then of the First Nations of those continents today, whether in Brazil, whether in Peru, Bolivia, certainly in the United States and and Canada. And with it then, the way in which slavery developed through the bringing of Africans to the United States and elsewhere as slaves. And then in more modern times, how post-slavery, the implementation of all-out segregation and what's called the Jim Crow laws in the United States. So in fact, when we look at what's happened, including the rebellion of Black Lives Matter and the way that Hispanics and people of color are treated in the United States and elsewhere in the Americas. So we actually see as South Africans so clearly the similarities between the civil rights movement of the 60s, and we were aware of this as we battled against apartheid in South Africa. And it was also why we had such enormous support from African Americans and the Black lobby in Congress, which rebelled against Reagan, who regarded Mandela and our movement as terrorist. And they applied and forced through sanctions against apartheid South Africa. So we were actually very inspired. I was a young student myself in 1960s, early 60s, at what was happening under Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. It inspired us. And in turn, the inspiration from South Africa's struggle affected people of color everywhere in the world, and then of course people of conscience. So we reached across, as Black Lives Matter has recently, reached across race divides, and it's a wonderful, exciting thing to see today, how people come together against white supremacy. And this, of course, is going to happen within Israel. We know of this and see it through our own experience. So I want to now come more towards the comparison from South Africa and South Africans going to Israel. More and more, when freedom-loving South Africans, because we've got a lot who are not freedom-loving, as you have white supremacists in the States, there's still pockets and groups who are highly prejudiced here, and amongst them are Christian evangelicals who take their trips to the Holy Land. But when South Africans, non-racist and freedom-loving, and especially those who were involved in the liberation struggle, have traveled to the occupied territories in the first place, but Israel as well, we have been appalled. And from the time Archbishop Desmond Tutu visited in 1988, before South Africa overcame apartheid with our democratic election in 1994, he came away as a Christian so appalled that he said he sees apartheid in practice, that the Palestinians are as badly off as blacks in South Africa. That was in 1988. As we know from the Intifada then, into much greater oppression and brutality. So those of us who then visited actually said, this is worse than what we saw in South Africa. Because, and I explained this to Arafat when I visited him, and I was a minister, and I visited him in 2004, sometime earlier in the year. You remember he got ill later in the year, was clearly poisoned, assassinated, he died later that year. And he said to me in his bombed out headquarters in Ramallah, where he was actually besieged, he wasn't being able to leave, and it was all bomb strewn. And he says to us, and I'm leading the delegation, look around you and see, this is a Bantustan. And I replied, no, President, Bantustans are much better off. His eyes were as wide as saucers. And I explained that no Bantustan, and of course the objective was the same in South Africa, to create the Balkanization of South Africa, all these little Bantustans, so as to push the black people there, the indigenous Africans, and strip them of all rights in greater South Africa. They were never bombed by aeroplanes. Tanks never had to roll in. They didn't have walls. You could just move in across invisible frontiers where there might have just been a sign, and occasionally when there was tension, you would then find police posts and a few, maybe a couple of armored cars. There was never the kind of massacres that one saw. As a boy growing up in South Africa in the 40s, I'm born in 1938, and when you're about 6, 7, you become aware of what's further than your garden gate. And I used to be appalled. So look, I'm a Jewish kid growing up in just the post-war period, having heard all these dreadful stories about the Nazis and the way Jews are treated. And I used to say to my mother, is this how Jews were being treated in Europe by the Germans? Because of what you could see. And this is what I saw when I went into Palestine in the occupied territories. The queues, the lines of black people, waiting for buses, second-class buses, and there were so few amenities on cold, rainy days and nights to go in and out, commuting to the factories, to the towns, and back to distant townships where they had been moved to, with houses demolished. And if anybody stepped out of line, we would see as kids the police descending on them, or white thugs attacking them. And this is what we could relate to in going into the occupied territories, but of course much worse, given the militarization and military occupation, the sullen faces of those in the checkpoints queuing up, the sullen faces that I grew up with in South Africa, which opened my heart to those who were oppressed, humiliated, segregated, deprived of rights. I mention that there are phases in the awakening of the comparison, because initially, to some degree, we knew things weren't good for the Palestinians who had managed to hang on within Israel, called the 1948 Palestinians. But we didn't realize the extent to which they were subject to laws that prevented them from living where they wished, from building properties, from building businesses, from developing their homes, from literally being segregated in practice, even if the laws appeared to cover up the fact that Israel was not democratic. It took some time. So we began, and I'm talking about when South Africa became free, and we had the ability to boycott to boycott Israel, to declare our positions against Israeli oppression and the end of occupation, accepting and falling into the trap of the Oslo Accords. It took a few years to begin to realize the discriminatory system under which the Palestinians, the Christians, the Muslims, Bedouin, lived within Israel itself. And that was quite a shock. So it took some time. And then as we became much more aware and could visit Palestinians within Israel and had greater contacts, and we brought them to South Africa, delegations from occupied territories, from within Israel, civil society, and so on. We became much more educated and came to understand the fact that this was apartheid, not just in Jimmy Carter's reference to the occupied territories, but within Israel itself. And then under Sharon and moving towards, with the breakdown of two-state solution and Oslo, and moving into these horrendous years from Sharon to Netanyahu, to really understand the extent of this apartheid system within Israel itself, which has come so much to the fore in two ways recently. And of course, the one is Netanyahu in the move towards a Jewish state, so only a Jewish state, and then the deal of the century, and this kind of development.
Deal. What do you mean by deal of the century? I missed that.
Well, the Trump steal of the century. You know, this was the last century. Well,
Right.
this is the beginning of the century. Jared Kushner and so on. The so-called normalization. So we became much more aware of the laws, which total over 50 into 60 laws, discriminatory laws against the Palestinian people living within Israel.
I was very much involved in the nascent anti-apartheid movement in our college campus. It was really just beginning. And actually, although Harvard got the reputation for where it started, in fact, I think in the University of Wisconsin in Madison, a very radical college, is where we really were very aggressive and fought very hard to force a divestment of the University of Wisconsin's holdings and companies doing business in South Africa. And that was in 1979 considered extremely radical. But today,
and I remember how you subversives at Wisconsin, how you inspired us. I was in exile and I worked in the military camps in Angola where we were, you know, had our base camps, etc. And how inspired our young black guys were to realize there was this kind of solidarity and to realize there were white guys around the world who were supporting our struggle. And it goes so far towards deracializing the conflict. It's so important, the solidarity aspect. It works both ways.
It was amazing, and people really came out, and we had thousands of people out there protesting eventually, and blocking, shutting down their meetings. The border regions, they just got finished with the Vietnam War protests, and now this new thing was coming, like a huge
absolutely
wave. And and then later you saw that, you know, the Bruce Springsteen and the other musicians were getting in on it, and it really started to snowball to had a big effect. And I don't think it's the only thing, but I think it was contributed to, of course, struggles that were going on within South Africa itself to change the apartheid system. And it was successful in the end. And the part of the success was to see Nelson Mandela in New York City in front of thousands of people giving a speech. And I have to say I was there and helped, and I saw him go by in his car and waved, which is very meaningful to me. And other friends of mine actually got to shake his hand because we provided the staging and everything for that, which is interesting.
Absolutely. Look, that was wonderful. And we still look at those films, and they're still shown on television in South Africa on specific occasions. And what I want to say to you is the importance of international solidarity can't be overestimated. It's incredible. We, in the process of the struggle, and there was a call for boycott from the time of Sharpeville, actually even before, when the Sharpeville massacres 1960, the ANC and its allies in South Africa, supported by the likes of Julius Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah in Africa, called, first of all, on Britain, the major trading partner and historically the colonial power with South Africa, the people of Britain to engage in a boycott. That was of products. That boycott developed into boycott, divestment, and sanctions that you referred to, which you referred to as BDS today, in relation to the campaign to bring pressure to bear on apartheid Israel. In the process of that growing international support that we received, we came to develop what we called the 4 strategic pillars of our struggle, 4 pillars of struggle. Now, the primary one is always the oppressed people engaged in struggle against tyranny. And we talked about the need in our conditions of absolute illegality to reinforce that with an underground network able to bring out leaflets and literature and give guidance to the public organs and mass struggle, the primary one. So this is reinforced. I say this now, that the third pillar, and it's entirely up to those who are struggling against tyranny, but in Mandela's own words, when he was in the dock in 1963, facing a possible death sentence for having embarked on a sabotage campaign, the beginnings of armed insurrection, that we were forced into it because with the Sharpeville massacre and then the banning of organizations such as the African National Congress, Communist Party, Pan-Africanist Congress, there were no other legal means to bring about change. So we had to resort to armed struggle. So we talk about the armed struggle. We always said no question of terrorism, of attacking people because of skin color, but the system was what we aimed to deal with. And that was to reinforce the mass struggle of our people. But we talked about the fourth pillar, international solidarity, which became BDS. And we've said that all of those were of such great importance and together organically brought about the demise, the overthrow of apartheid. You refer to the Vietnam struggle, and of course there was a worldwide movement of protest against America's aggression and invasion, and the Vietnamese fought against that, as we well know, heroically, and won in the end. It was General Giap who made reference to the importance, and Ho Chi Minh, to the importance of international solidarity as a vital component of the struggle for justice against colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperialism, aggression, and so on. So what does this lesson of South Africa and our struggle against apartheid teach? The people of Palestine and Israel, including Jewish people within Israel, we point to them, to the whites, and we were a very small minority, that it was so important that there were, even if it was a handful, at times never more than a few hundred, it became in the end, as the mass struggle became more and more powerful in the late 80s, leading up to the change from 1990 when negotiations were forced on the regime, that the fact that the movement could draw in whites, it exposed the myth of racism, which appeals to all of your dominant race. You've got no life, no future, no security outside our encampment. So you've got to fight with us to the death, the way Trump called on his troops. But when within that, we call it a lager. It's like in the America, in the United States, when you had this dreadful pioneering, the conquest of the West, and the wagons would form what we call a lager. I don't know, that's a South African word.
Right.
This
we call
encirclement.
Yeah, here we call it, well, we had the wagon trains out west, but we call
Yes.
it, what's the word? I should know my own history. When you go out to the west, it was manifest destiny. It was not a religious movement. It was a national movement to take, and they sort of didn't stop at California. They took it as far as Japan and China and Vietnam and all these places.
Exactly.
It could wind up in South Africa.
Yes. So you know, the similarities and the metaphors and the vision, the imagery is very similar. And with the pioneer white Dutchman who left the Cape because of British imperial rule there, and the end of slavery, these Boer or Afrikaner settler farmers who'd been there from 17th century, they got in their ox wagons and they trekked into the interior away from British rule. And they would form these encampments with the wagons in a circle to fight off the attacks from the indigenous tribal people whose land they were invading. So I'm using that, and we call this the metaphor, the lager. It's an Afrikaans term. In relation to Israel, Greater Israel, it's lager, and bringing all the Jews within that ghetto, actually, that encampment. And that's what South African colonialism, white supremacy, and then called apartheid. That's the metaphor used. And it did have huge religious connotations from the imperialist Dutch and British, first of all, in terms of colonization, the civilizing mission, and they had to fight off the indigenous people, as was the case in North and South America. They didn't achieve what happened in North and South America because the Black indigenous people in South Africa were at quite an advanced proto-nation state with very powerful military forces. They were smashed by the British, to be sure, but the numbers were so great that, unlike the situation and demographics within Israel, the Afrikaner or apartheid just couldn't deal with this overwhelming number and had to, and for its economic system, relied on them as labor, which is the very big difference between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel.